Hi, this is Junia Meintjes, and this is my presentation on the artistic creative processes of one of my favorite franchises, the Borderlands franchise. One of the unique qualities in the Borderlands franchises is its art. Hand-painted textures with a slight stylization in it, making it more cartoony, became one of the beneficial factors in making Borderlands the Game of the Year in 2007. And although I don't have Borderlands 1, I do have its better looking sibling, Borderlands 2, which has kept that same iconic art style from its predecessor. Although this art style would be a staple on the franchise, it almost never happened. In 2007, when the first game was announced and shown to the public, Borderlands had a dark and more grim tone with photorealistic graphics like many of its other competitors at the time. After the E3 conference, Gearbox decided to hide the new FPS from the public eye. In 2009, the game would re-submerge with a fresh new look, going from a realistic to a full hand-drawn environment, with black accents as outlines to make the game feel more comic book-like, which would ultimately suit the game even better, and would ultimately become one of Gearbox's most ambitious, biggest risks ever made for the franchise, getting rid of any previous environment textures in replacing it for the new one that we all come to know today. This phenomenon became known as the 11th hour style change. Don't try this at home. And although the change would prove beneficial to the game, it would also mean the end of one game artist's career. The original director became so disheartened at the fact that all of her hard work would eventually be just thrown out the door, and eventually she left Gearbox and left the game art industry altogether. Now, a common misconception with the art style of Borderlands is that Gearbox used something called cel shading for the textures in the game, when really it's not true at all. Now, for those who do not know what cel shading is, I'm going to give you a brief rundown on what it is. Cel shading is, or toon shading, is a type of render used to make 3D objects in a scene appear flat, whilst keeping their 3D integrity. They do this by using minimal tones of color and gradient, making highlights and shadows just one block of color, rather than mixing it in with textures on said surface. Another step in the process of making cel shading textures would be to use black ink outlines to make a silhouette of an object, giving it an overall appearance of an anime or a cartoon. And although one might argue there's similarities in both art styles, the difference comes in the techniques in creating both effects. Unlike cel shading, Gearbox does not create the effects via render. All textures were hand-painted through Photoshop. Even the outlines on the environment, characters, and other objects are drawn in Photoshop, with the help of other software to just bring out those black accents for the outlines of the characters. This would result in the game looking more like a comic book rather than a cartoon, which I think Gearbox was actually trying to go for. One last thing I'd like to point out is a question as to why. Why change the overall tone, the environment, the textures of the game when you're almost completed? Well, we already glossed over one reason, and it was due to them trying to stick out and be different, be unique, compared to the other predecessors or the other FPS shooters releasing at that time. Throughout the entire game, from the characters to the story to even the gameplay, you're given a little bit of a sense of humor, although sometimes dark. With the whole tone of the game, the story, the characters, and even the gameplay, Borderlands seemed to contain somewhat of a settled, though sometimes sense dark humor throughout the game. Even the announcement trailer for Borderlands 1, which was made before the art change, had a slight humorous tone to it. Unlike its competitors at the time, like Battlefield and Call of Duty and other FPSs, Borderlands was a game that never really took itself too seriously. The fact that you had guns that could talk, fly around, and in the newest game, had guns with legs. The fact that 90% of these guns didn't even shoot bullets and shot everything else, literally, proved that Gearbox wanted to go down a different path for FPS shooters, unlike Call of Duty and Battlefield, which wanted to go for a more realistic approach. And making the whole world feel like a comic book really felt like a cherry on the top kind of deal. It really added to the whole experience to Borderlands, compared to before, when most of the graphics were focused on realistic textures. And although other games have adopted this technique of going for a comic book look, Borderlands remains as the arrowhead for the comic book style. Today, Gearbox still uses this comic book style for Borderlands 3, and although changes have been applied to the technique, making it a little bit more realistic in terms of how it lights up with its surroundings, the core principle is still there, to stand out and to be entertaining. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.